All right, guys, welcome to Anger Management Group, module number 6, right? Today we're going to talk about destructive thinking. Destructive thinking, right? So, destructive thinking is simply having assumptions about ourselves and other people, or maybe life in general, that work against you, right? So, destructive thinking includes errors in the way we think, right? Based upon unreliable thoughts or concepts, right? Which lead to unhealthy situations, right? And so, in order to learn to effectively manage your anger, you need to learn to effectively manage your destructive thinking, right? And so, where does destructive thinking come from? Well, it's kind of learned behavior, right? Just as anger management is learned behavior, destructive thinking is learned behavior, right? And so we get these unhealthy thoughts from our parents, maybe teachers or friends, right? Or maybe the people around us, right? In our environment, people in our neighborhood, right? Can create unhealthy or destructive thinking in your life, right? They are typically so basic to our thinking and feeling that we do not recognize them as being destructive at all, right? That's the scary part, is that they become so ingrained in who we are that we just totally lose sight of how destructive that they are to our lives. All right, and we just think that they're truth. We take them as truth. Come in here, sir. And so the role that this plays in anger management is, right, that we need to become aware of our destructive thinking, right? Just as we become aware of our anger so that we can learn to manage it, we need to become aware of our destructive thoughts so that we can replace it with healthier thoughts, with more logical thoughts, and thoughts that help us versus thoughts that work against us, right? So, there are different examples of of destructive thinking, right? And the first one is all or nothing thinking, right? So this is people who think in either black or white, right or wrong, right? All or nothing, right? So we had a client here not that long ago, last year, um, and he was very he struggled with anger management. He was very easily excitable in his anger, right? He didn't know how to manage his anger. And he struggled with all or nothing thinking because if he saw a client sneak an extra bag of chips and take it up to his room at night, he became angry because he's like, that person's fake, right? Because they're not following all of the rules, right? And so that would create this anger inside of him, and he would start calling people fake and calling up all this stuff, and it created a lot of negative interactions with him in the house, right? And so it was because he had this all or nothing thinking. Either you follow all the rules or you're just fake, right? And so this is like this whole black or white thinking that there's no shades of gray. It's either good or bad, right? Or you're either completely competent or you're incompetent, right? It's just all or nothing, and there's no middle ground, right? And we know that that's not healthy, right? That there has to be middle ground for everything. There has to be gray area, right? And in fact, that's the way most of us live our lives, is kind of in the middle, right? And so, it's that's just kind of here's another example. The concert was the greatest or it was the worst, right? It can't be just an okay concert, right? So that's all or nothing thinking, right? And this creates a critical uh, um, person, basically, because they're going to start judging other people because they're not doing it perfectly, right? The next destructive thought are shoulds, right? You try to motivate yourself with shoulds and should nots, right? Or musts or oughts, right? So you tell yourself that things should be the way you hoped or expected them to be, right? When you place should statements on others, the emotional result is frustration, annoyance, or anger, right? So this is telling people you should or I should, right? I should look both ways before crossing the street. I should not tailgate that car just because the driver cut me off, right? Um, that's kind of a healthy perspective of shoulds, right? However, shoulds may also reflect unrealistic standards, such as I should get along with every boss I ever have, right? That's kind of unrealistic, right? Yeah, you should look both ways before crossing a street, but it doesn't mean you should get along with every boss you've ever had, right? That's not realistic, right? Or he should have addressed his anger problem earlier, and now he's been involved in a legal problem, right? That's kind of a critical, he should have done this before he got himself into trouble, right? That's kind of the downside of shoulds, is that it's placing kind of this judgment on people, right? So anytime you demand shoulds of other people, or you demand shoulds on yourself, that's going to create anger. Catastrophizing, right? This is where you take a situation, you blow it completely out of proportion, right? Such as, you wake up in the morning and you hit your toe on the corner of the bed, right? And then you're like, oh, my whole day's ruined now, right? That's catastrophizing one situation, right? You blow things out of proportion, thinking that the outcome of the challenging situation is just going to be a complete disaster, right? Everything is a complete disaster because this one thing happened to you, right? And that is not healthy, right? Not healthy. We need to anticipate the very worst, right? Even when the outcome is highly improbable. That is what the catastrophizing is about. You begin to think about the worst case scenario and everything just because one thing happened to you, right? You are basically predicting a catastrophe in your life, right? And so that is not healthy. The next one is overgeneralizing, right? So you tend to think in absolute terms as always and never, right? So first there's the shoulds or must or oughts, and now we have the always and never, right? Overgeneralizing. Let's see. You draw a conclusion. You're basically drawing the conclusion about a person's behavior, such as he's always a slob, right? Or he never does his detail, right? Anytime you use the word always or never, you are creating this absolute type thinking, right? And so, someone says you never pick up after yourself. Well, have I done it at least one time? Didn't I do it last night? Yeah, you did last night. Well, then it's not always, right? And so this is kind of overgeneralizing. They take a pattern of behavior and they just say you always do that one thing, or you never do that one thing. And this creates a lot of arguments, especially when you think about it in terms of family and marriage. This gets used a lot, right? And so you can always you can tell yourself, I'm a hopeless failure, right? I'll never make it in life. Those are absolute statements, right? Using always and never. I'll never be able to trust you again, or you always put me down, right? And so those are types of destructive thinking, right? Because it's overgeneralizing. All right, the next one is minimizing or magnifying, right? So this is where you exaggerate the importance of problems or shortcomings, right? So you receive many positive comments about your work from your peers, but one of them says you should have spoken louder, and you begin to obsess about his reaction for days, feeling embarrassed and angry, right? And you ignore all of the positive feedback. So you take one little thing and you just blow it out of proportion, right? So here's an example of this, right? We see this kind of fairly common. Like you find out about your cousin's brother's sister's step brother who you've met one time in your life, right? And you find out that he dies while you're here in treatment. And people blow that all out of proportion of like, oh my gosh, my best friend in my whole world died, right? But the truth is you only met the person one time, and you weren't that close to him, and things like that. You take getting another example is you get unsatisfactory on your room check, right? and you just kind of blow this up into a huge argument, right? Where you start attacking staff and cussing out staff and slamming doors, and I'm not going to do all my work today because I got a bad room check, right? That's magnifying the problem. The next one is taking it personally, right? This is where you personalize everything, right? Everything relates to just you, right? You take the responsibility for everything, right? So, you have you say the reason my marriage is bad is so lousy is because my partner is totally unreasonable, right? So, you're taking the whole blame, right? So this is kind of the blame game, right? And so, say your detail team, right, doesn't do a good job, right? And then you take all the blame for it, right? So taking it personally, where everything is about you, right? Like if we give feedback to the group and you think that the PC is talking directly to you, right? That's taking it personally. The next one is emotional reasoning, right? This is where you assume that your negative emotions reflect the way things really are, right? I feel terrified about going on airplanes. It must be dangerous to fly. Or I feel angry. This proves that I'm being treated unfairly, or I feel hopeless. I must really be hopeless, right? The belief is that you are what you feel, right? You feel angry, I'm an angry person. You feel hopeless, I'm a hopeless person, right? The next one is jumping to conclusions, right? So you interpret situations negatively, even though there are no facts to support your conclusion, right? You basically misinterpret a statement, or you misinterpret situations, right? You take everything out of context, right? Maybe you ignore important information and you come up with a negative conclusion, right? So the example here is James learns that Lauren has given permission to their teenager to go to a party without discussing the situation with him. James concludes that Lauren is intentionally punishing him because of a recent argument they had. So he's jumping to the conclusion there. The next one is labeling. Your assignment of a negative label, you give a negative label to a person's character, right? Instead of saying, I made a mistake, you attach a negative label to yourself of, I'm a loser, right? So you give yourself a label. You might call yourself a fool or a failure or a jerk just because you messed up, right? So using labels in a negative way. Mind reading, right? You may assume that someone is reacting negatively towards you and don't check your assumptions, right? So Mr. Craig writes you up for sleeping in group, and then you assume that Mr. Craig is mad at you, right? You're mind trying to do mind reading. All right. Requiring specialness, right? Basically, you want to be treated different than other people, right? And then if you're not, then you get angry over it. All right. And then the next one is the need to be right. Got to be right, right? You have difficulty tolerating being wrong, right? And so this causes problems, right? All right. So your thoughts to